Okay, so we've read four books of the Odyssey. Just a heads up, my cat Camille is here to help. Say hi, Camille. Camille is very much into classical poetry. I'm trying to get her to appreciate more modern texts, but she's a traditionalist. So what I thought would be good is to give a sort of preview of what my classes often discuss. We stop after the first four books. We spend a day sort of gathering questions, gathering important quotations. They write a 1 to 2 page response to either a critical question they have or a quotation that stands out, and we have a roundtable discussion. So it's just a time for them to stop and to consider what has stood out to them so far. And the nice thing about a text like this is there's nearly an infinite number of things we can talk about. So what I'll discuss today is what commonly comes up after four books of reading this. What's curious is, and I wrote here, what's curious is that this is the world of Odysseus we're learning about before we meet Odysseus. And it strikes me that in almost every significant Shakespeare play, maybe with the exception of Richard III, we don't meet the protagonist right away. We meet, in Macbeth, we meet witches. In Henry V, we meet a group of bishops arguing about land rights. In Hamlet, we meet guards outside the castle in Elsinore, and the list goes on. And it's almost as if Shakespeare wants us to have the values and the feelings and the fears of a world before introducing us to the main character of that world. And I don't think Homer was known to Shakespeare necessarily. I'm not sure if he had access. I know his focus was more on Latin literature growing up in school. But what's interesting is there's something intuitive in both of them, it seems, that they don't start with their main character. I mean, we hear about Odysseus. He sort of shadows the first four chapters, but he's not literally in them acting in real time. So anyway, these are just 10 things that tend to come up after the first four books of the Odyssey. First, so number one, I teach freshmen, and if they had any experience with Homer, it's a youth version of this, or stories, or the Lightning Thief books, all of which are great. But when you're reading the unadulterated thing, the unabridged text, there is from my experience, a 4 to 6 book long tuning process where your ear has to be tuned, not just to the diction or syntax, but you have to grow accustomed to hearing who people's fathers and grandfathers are, even people that aren't even significant characters. And you have to be okay with hearing not only a geographical detail, but something peculiar about the geographical detail, or something historical about it. Or not only the fact that Telemachus goes to bed at the end of book one, but we get this long discussion about the door and the latch and the bed. And so I think we have a choice as readers here, and students have a choice as readers. You could just get frustrated at the seeming sort of long-windedness of these descriptions, or you could ask yourself, let me put my reading preferences sort of at the door here. Why would these characters in this story, and why would the original audience of this story want to know about those things? What do little details add? So I think challenge number one, and it's a good discussion point, just honest. What is it like listening to and reading this story? And is it different, reading the fourth book than it was maybe starting it? I think that sort of honest conversation is actually really helpful, because students are going to hear that pretty much everybody in class is struggling with something, and there's some consolation to that. Secondly, and this is obviously nearly immediate in the poem, is the role of the gods. And the first out loud conversation in the poem is between Zeus and Athena. And Zeus, as we'll see in a few minutes, is complaining about humans, and Athena focuses him on the plight of her guy, Odysseus. But the role of the gods are almost on every page. Either they're literally there, or they're there in disguise, or they're being sacrificed to. It's just the sort of heartbeat of this culture is considering what the role of the gods and the will of the gods is. And we're going to talk in a sec about why that's difficult. So a really important word that I think we need to continue talking about is this idea of piety, which is just a fancy way of saying following God's will. The apostrophe here is really important. We're dealing with a polytheistic world, more than one God. So the apostrophe is after the S. One of the most elucidating texts that has to do with this question of piety is the Socratic dialogue, the Euthyphro. We see the name here. And Socrates meets Euthyphro, and Euthyphro is on his way to prosecute his father for killing a slave. And that can be discussed. But what intrigues Socrates, which often intrigues him, is that Euthyphro is so sure that what he's doing is right. So Socrates gets him to say that I am prosecuting my father because it's the pious thing to do. Socrates then gets him to realize that piety is doing the will of the gods, what I have here on the slide. But then Socrates points out a problem, and this problem sort of trickles into the Odyssey as well. And the problem is that the gods don't agree, or as Socrates says, the gods are in discord. They fight. So if you're trying to do the will of the gods, but the gods fight, doing the will of the gods is actually impossible, literally, logically impossible. And similar to the rich man in the Gospels, Euthyphro has this moment where he could follow what's true and change his life, or just keep doing what he's doing and walk away. And that's what he chooses to do, is to walk away. So the idea of piety is so important to all the characters in the epic. But it's not an easy idea to wrap their heads around, and they're all trying to figure out what following God's will means. And they do things that are pretty common. They sacrifice to the gods, they pray, they pay attention to omens. But what's challenging is that everybody that does these things doesn't have a happy, great life. So this is one of those like very human things where goodness isn't always rewarded. So there can, people can question the power and the goodness of the gods. So it's a really complicated idea. It isn't so simple as defining the term piety. You see a lot of characters in the poem struggling with it. Somewhat connected to piety is this notion of xenia, which I mentioned in my introductory presentation. And xenia is that idea of hospitality. And, here it looks nice. There's people taking care of each other. But the reality is, xenia is a complicated idea, and we've already seen it. We see the suitors abusing the hospitality of Penelope and Telemachus by eating everything of theirs over and over again. And we see Telemachus in book 3 go to Pylos to visit Nestor, and we see the hospitality there. And then he goes to Menelaus and Helen to Sparta, and he sees hospitality there. So there's plenty of examples in the poem of strangers, which is the term used. And Wilson says that the Greek word for strangers is also connotes immigrants, which is interesting. But there's also a danger, and particularly if you're a teacher. But the reason to buy Emily Wilson's translation is for her long, clearly written, and super informative introduction. She says on page 91 of her introduction, it is that long, the poem is concerned above all, interesting phrase, with the duties and dangers involved in welcoming strangers in a one house. The above all part's interesting. A lot of translators and scholars would say that this is about manhood or following the will of the gods or, virtue. And she's actually saying that the number one theme of this poem is welcoming strangers. The reason why there's dangers involved is if a stranger wandered into your neighborhood and knocked on your door and wasn't from your town, the presumption was that this person did something horrible to get banished from their town. So it wasn't as if they were just, on vacation. So there was a danger in welcoming strangers. So the strangers could just be people like Telemachus on like a fact-finding mission, or they could be criminals. So there was a danger, but it was this notion that the strangers could be gods in disguise. So xenia can't be seen as sort of like a self-evident, obvious, easy thing. There's a danger involved to that kind of kindness. As I mentioned in the early introductory presentation, Odysseus, who we're about to meet in book 5, is primarily known for the Greek characteristic metis, which there isn't an exact translation, but cleverness is the best one. And there'll be plenty of examples of Odysseus's cleverness, and I would argue his lack of cleverness at some pretty important times. But it's interesting. I think cleverness is a family trait. We know that Penelope, seen here, undoing her funeral shroud for her father-in-law, she had promised the suitors, I have to weave, I should say, a funeral shroud for Laertes, my father-in-law. When I'm done, I'll marry one of you. And a servant finds out that she's unraveling it every night just to prolong, not marrying one of the suitors. They find out about it. But in a way, it's her sort of example of meta. She can't fight, with a sword like warriors can, like men can. So this is the sort of cleverness that she can exhibit, and she does. And part of me wonders, is that a sign of like a love match between her and her husband? They have this thing in common. I guess I could also argue that Telemachus grows in metis as well. He goes to 2 foreign places, interacts with kings. He's a teenager, knows sort of when to talk, when not to talk, who to trust, who not to trust. But I would suggest paying attention to the idea of cleverness or metis, certainly in Odysseus, but throughout the play. Who ends up with, being clever in this entire play? And that, clearly the Iliad focuses quite a bit on kleos and, warfare and heroism in war. But it's interesting in the context that we're in here, we're seeing the idea of metis becoming really significant. So here's a term. I just want to point to this meme that kind of blew my mind, that Toy Story could eventually change into The Office. I just love that idea. But that being said, there's this fancy German word that if you want to sound really smart, you can throw around, bildungsroman, which is a fancy way. I would write it down. There's a fancy way. It's a fancy way of saying a text about a boy growing up. A text about a boy growing up. And there's various traditional elements of the bildungsroman. It often involves some sort of challenge at home, a journey away from home, overcoming significant obstacles, some sort of return. But so far, we meet Telemachus, who's just an emotional kid whose mother's being maltreated and whose father's gone. Think about who he is in the beginning of the poem and think about, who he is by the end of book 4. I'm not saying he's totally evolved into a fully grown man, but I think this book, this poem has some interesting things to say about what growing up entails. For example, and this could be an interesting conversation topic. Do you have to leave home for a while to grow up? Could you be someone who never really leaves your hometown and really be grown up? It's a legitimate conversation. Within the poem, it doesn't seem so. But the theme of growing up is important. I would argue, even though Odysseus chronologically is a man throughout, the poem, I would argue that he evolves as well. But Telemachus is the real bildungsroman, his story. 7, how does the poem define evil? I guess the easy way of saying it is, if you figure out how the poem defines goodness, I would equate that with piety, doing God's will. So maybe evil in this poem is not doing the God's will. But as we already said, because the gods fight, what is good and evil now? I mean, if Telemachus does what Athena wants, that automatically means that he's not doing what Poseidon wants. So what is goodness, evil, or piety in these situations? We see here the quote, the first spoken words of the entire epic on the second page of the Wilson translation. We see her translation of this passage. It's Zeus, just a frustrated lightning god. Upon my word, just see how mortal men always put the blame on us gods, that we're the source of evil, so they say, when they have only their own madness to think if the miseries are worse than they ought to be. So there's a lot of definitions of evil. Is it simply just when gods curse you? Is it imprudent or bad choices, individual choices? Is it fate? So evil is also complicated. You'll notice I seem hedging. We've only read a sixth of the epic. I'm just introducing what often comes up as the big ideas of the first four chapters. And because it's a classic, these ideas are messy. Okay. I think this one isn't discussed very often. It's one of the most intriguing aspects of great literature to me, that in great literature, you can never rest. That's why I really endorse reading, listening, experiencing literature as many different ways as possible, annotating, discussing, writing. That in the greatest literature, there's no character that's utterly powerless, that there could be surprising moments of power from anyone. Late in book 4, for example, which this scene depicts, Penelope, the queen lying on her bed, is lamenting over the fact that, yes, she's missing her husband for over a decade and a half, but more than that, she's just been told that her beloved son Telemachus is about to get ambushed by the suitors and killed. So her whole world is getting destroyed. And she ends up getting really frustrated at her servants, threatening them that they let Telemachus go on this journey without telling her. So at the end of book 4, we have the bottom of page 175 in the Emily Wilson translation, line 743. Eurycleia, the woman here who helped raise Telemachus, says to Penelope, "Lady, sweetheart, even if you take a sword and kill me, I will tell the truth." And she ends up talking about how she helped Telemachus go on his journey to get information about Odysseus. But I just find that how she says this, she doesn't say, feel better, everything's going to be fine tomorrow, or I'm sure Telemachus is going to be okay. This servant whose property, I mean, it's like she's like a microwave oven or a car, to be honest. This servant speaks like a warrior. I will tell you the truth, and you could kill me if you want. I mean, she does not care about her own physical life. She wants to sort of heroically tell the truth in this moment. So I just find that interesting. It's just, again, really be deliberate reading this poem, listen, read, because you just never know. It's full of surprises like this. One of the most interesting recent discussions of Homer is by Dr. Jonathan Shea, who's a psychiatrist who works with veterans, mainly veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder. So a little over a decade ago, he wrote this brilliant book, Achilles in Vietnam, Combat Trauma and the Undoing of Character. And it's basically a marriage of his work with Vietnam veterans and a reading of the Iliad. It was so well received that he wrote a sequel, Odysseus in America, Combat Trauma and the Trials of Homecoming. Why is it so difficult for soldiers to return home? So he's careful to not psychologically diagnose Odysseus, to not just easily say he has PTSD and that's it, and that explains everything. But some of the most poignant moments of the first 4 chapters are when grizzled, war veterans, Nestor and Menelaus specifically, speak of Odysseus and speak of the Trojan War. I think of Menelaus's beautiful moment. He's the richest man in the world, married to the most beautiful woman in the world, with an opulent, property and everything you could want on paper. And he says to Telemachus, before he even realizes he's talking to Odysseus' son, that Odysseus was cursed to have this life of suffering. He said, and my destiny was the pain of missing him. That he even says, I would trade this in to have all these lives of my friends back. And there's just some really poignant moments. And I think, this doesn't explain everything about what's amazing about the poem. It's also, a poem. It's not history and it's not psychology. But I just want to say that most first-time readers, especially when they're young kids like the ones I teach this poem to, most first-time readers are not inherently interested in ancient Greek literature. So discussing it in terms of trauma, in terms of current studies of war trauma, is an interesting way of drawing the modern reader in, because it is, and we'll talk about this, later, there's some just really powerful moments in the Odyssey where men are undergoing trauma, and now we have sort of psychological apparatus and language to discuss it. Homer just gives raw descriptions, but it's a really interesting parallel to our world today that, like I said, can draw new readers in. And lastly, and one of the most interesting things that we see in books 1 to 4 that we see throughout the book, throughout the epic, is the challenge of telling what is real, right? Think of all the characters in disguise. How do you know this isn't a god trying to doom you? How do you know it's trying to be helpful? Think of Helen's story about Odysseus during the Trojan War, dressing like a beggar. Think about all the different stories Telemachus has probably heard about his father. Sure, his mother Penelope has told him stories. He might have heard the suitors talk about him. Maybe his grandfather Laertes talked about him. He's heard Nestor talk about him. He's heard Helen talk about him. He's heard Menelaus talk about him. But at some point, as you're growing up, you have to determine what's important, what's not, what's real, and what's not. This gets really interesting as the poem goes on. And again, similar to the PTSD, theme, this is a way to hook new readers in, because many of our conversations now are, right, fake news, what's real, what do I believe about the COVID vaccine, where do I get my information? How do Google searches work? What sites am I brought to based on my history? With technology, am I brought to what's true and real, or am I just brought to things that the algorithm thinks I like? That social dilemma documentary on Netflix is one of the most amazing things I've seen. So our world is dealing with the same exact thing. It's not gods in disguise, but it's if the internet is sort of like Greek gods for us. So these are just 10 conversation starters that come up that kids tend to notice. They maybe use different language than I use, but these are just some trends after the first 4 books. I hope this helps, and good luck with the rest of the epic.